Hi, everybody. First of all, thank you so much for taking your evening to be here. My name is Dr. Kara Mild. I have been a clinician and mental health therapist for the past 20 years approximately, and I have also taught psychology at the university level for 12 years. I have a lot of experience working with the perinatal population, a lot of experience working with depression, anxiety, grief, and loss. And I'm really excited to be here. And I'm very passionate about what I do. I think of myself as a stigma reducer, an emotional healer. And I just thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here and to speak with you tonight. So we can go on and before there's going to be a quick poll that pops up so I would love to get to know the audience and see who is here and why you're here so that I can help you best. I want to start by saying grief is a universal experience. It's something that all cultures, all people deal with, yet it is so deeply personal. There's no right way to grieve. So I'm going to talk about strategies to manage grief tonight. And in that, I hope that we can take space to honor ourselves and the people we've lost. Please know as I talk about practical strategies, I am also keenly aware that there's nothing practical about grief. As someone who has lost their mother, I've lost a loved one, I've lost my sister-in-law to a fentanyl overdose. I've lost a dear family member to cancer. So I come to you not only as a professional, but someone who has sought counseling for this very topic that I'm speaking about. So let's move forward and let me talk a little bit as we go towards coping with grief. Just what is grief? We have to define things before we can even deal with them. So it's a natural emotional response to a loss. Now that sounds very benign, but of course a natural emotional response can be very overwhelming. People can be just devastated and crying and expressive, which is all normal. There's different types of losses. A death of a loved one, which many of you may have experienced, also divorce, the end of a job, um, a miscarriage for women. Those are all things that can end abruptly and cause us great pain and difficult emotional experiences where we may need to reach out for counseling and other supports. So let's move on to the next slide here. It looks like for some reason I'm seeing still the welcome. Let me see here. So I want to talk about the stages of grief, which should be the next slide, which for some reason, okay, there we go. You may have heard of this. Thank you. Lindsay is here supporting me, and thank you, Lindsay, behind the scenes. So the stages of grief, which again, grief is not linear and there's no right way to grieve, but Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is known for in the around the 1960s coming up with this sort of theory and works and writing, and maybe you have heard of it, but the first stage of grief is denial. So when someone's in denial, they are essentially refusing to accept reality. They don't acknowledge the reality of the loss. They're in a state of just complete shock. That first stage of grief is where all we can really do to intervene, if it's a friend, if it's a loved one, if it's someone, is just to be there with them. You don't even need to say anything or do anything in that moment. When someone is in denial, when they're in shock and disbelief, just being with them can be enough. It's not a time where we really want to say much, to offer explanations. Many people have the experience in grief and loss of, well, people say things that just don't really make sense, or and it's out of people don't know what to say. So I would say if you're not sure what to say to a loved one, especially when someone's in that first stage of shock, it's best to simply be with them as another human being and not say much of anything. The second stage that Kubler-Ross defined is anger. So this is where people can get really, really angry, maybe at themselves, maybe at the person that passed away. For example, I was recently working with a woman who's so angry at her son that he had bought this fast car. He got a job, saved money, and tragically was in a car accident that was not his fault. But the anger at like, well, why did he buy this car? There's a lot of why that I'll talk about, but the anger, very intense frustration, it can be directed at ourselves. Like, well, why didn't I do more? Could I have done more? Should I have said more? Or just the situation. Sometimes we have situations that are so incredibly difficult. For example, a child having an illness or cancer, and we think, it's just, we're human and we get very angry. The third stage would be bargaining. And this is where people might be bargaining with God. If they're religious, they might try to make deals or promises. I'll do this, I'll stop doing this. If only, if only this loss like could not happen. Of course, we can't go back in time. We can't make tragic things. We can't undo tragic things. But that bargaining, that kind of push and pull of inside of us as human beings is very real. And it's an attempt to psychologically delay the loss. So people can get stuck in these stages also. People may be stuck in anger for a while. People may be stuck in bargaining. Fourthly, and second to the last, depression. Just a deep sadness. And if you have felt this, you know what I'm talking about. This can be the paralyzing feeling of, I can't even get out of bed. The morning is so intense. And with depression, this is the part where people need more support. This is where I would say, okay, this is a good time to seek out counseling, to get support if you belong to any organization, church, community group, to seek out counseling. That deep sadness, when we can let things hit the air and talk about it, helps. And lastly, people come to acceptance. Sometimes, honestly, people don't come to acceptance, and some people never will reach acceptance, some do. And it's, in my opinion, a beautiful thing when we can come to accept what we've lost and honor what we have lost. So that would be the last stage. And I would say my hope and goal, for all of you would be, and myself as well, would be acceptance. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide from here. So some grief is more complicated than others. Complicated grief is defined, not that it's less or more or less hurtful by any means, but it's grief that's prolonged and it's more significantly impairs an individual's ability to function. So this is typically when there's more intense sorrow, a preoccupation with the circumstances of the death. For example, this occurs in very tragic situations that might involve suicide, homicide, um, just feelings. Complicated grief leads to really complicated and persistent feelings of numbness, sort of a detachment from reality. People can mildly disassociate, just feel numb. I also get very concerned about people in complicated grief that they might be at risk for substance abuse, risk for coping in turning to the wrong things or wrong ways of coping, which again, of course, we're human and can happen, but that is why help is so important. So risk factors also, if there's a history, if you already have a family history of depression, of anxiety, it's a very traumatic loss. You don't have support. You're much more at risk for what we would call complicated grief. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. Unresolved grief, another sort of subset of complicated grief, grief that has not been adequately processed or integrated. So we want to integrate into our psyches and that this loss has occurred, as difficult as that may be. When there's ambiguity surrounding loss, for example, a kidnapping and no one is ever found, and people do not know if their loved one is alive or dead. The ambiguity, not knowing, is it can be for some people worse than knowing. So when there can be persistent distress for years, and thinking, if law enforcement has, for example, not resolved a case, people may avoid reminders of the loss instead of honoring their loved one, looking at pictures, having rituals around the loss. They might not even be able to say the person's name. Those are all indicators to me that this is a unresolved grief. We want to be able to talk about our loved ones eventually when we have acceptance. So unresolved grief can lead to more significant mental health issues. So please, if you feel you have unresolved grief, reach out. We have so many therapists, I believe around approximately 80 at Advanced Care, but you getting help for depression and anxiety surrounding grief, so it does not lead to something worse like substance abuse or more loss, is very important. So that would be just a bit about what unresolved grief is and what that looks like. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. Coping. Immediate coping when someone has suffered a loss, acknowledging that loss, coping for ourselves and helping others cope. I'll talk about both. Coping for ourselves, allowing ourselves to feel the emotions. So this can include, we want to talk about the loved ones, the person that's deceased. We want to look at photos. We want to listen to their voice on videos, or maybe we have saved voicemails from them, that we want to find ways also to honor them. That can be, of course, through a funeral service, through some type of service, but I've seen people do all sorts of things to find ways to honor their loved ones. Sometimes it's a yearly ritual, like having an event in someone's honor, or it could be something simpler, such as every friends and family getting together as a yearly sort of celebration of life to remember the person. Now, if you're helping somebody cope with grief, for the person that is helping someone cope, it's your friend or family member, it may make you feel awkward to talk about the deceased. I can't stress enough how important it is to let someone look at pictures, say the loved one's name, just be there for them, hug them, support them, let them talk about their loss. That's very important. Seeking support with a loss, we need as much support as possible. This is an area where if you are isolated in grief, you are more at risk for depression, for substance abuse, for anxiety, for ongoing mental health problems. So support, I can't stress enough, having friends, family, community, a good therapist, people that you can talk to, and again, kind of letting the pain hit the air instead of keeping it suppressed is very important for our psychological makeup. Also creating rituals. This can be memorials. I love to have memorials in my home, like an area dedicated to pictures, to that particular individual, or ways that we can always remember the person. So that is unique to each individual, but I think creating rituals so that the person's legacy and memory continues to live on is very important. And self-care, taking care of yourself, this is something we're not good at as human beings when we're going through a tragedy. Remembering that self-care can be simple. Self-care doesn't have to be elaborate. It can be, did I get a shower, drink some water, and eat something today? If you have lost someone, you know just that can be very difficult to do, especially at the beginning stages of grief. So having a very simple basic routine is like very important. And finding different ways that you express your emotions. For some people, that's talking. Other people like to write. Other people like to engage in art or something creative that speaks to them. So whatever the outlet is, the idea is the same, that if we bottle emotions up, it becomes a pressure cooker. And I don't want that for anyone. So we absolutely need to have some healthy expression of emotion. Okay, we can move on to the next slide.
Through that is relevant to this slide here. They say, how can I help my family member participate in a ritual? I know it will help them.
That's a really good question. Thank you so much for asking that. And I realize that sometimes family members are not as, we'll say, receptive. The way I would handle this and the way I have handled this is to sort of lead by example and let them see me with a ritual, whether that be, I'm gonna light a candle and sit here and reflect for this time, and continuing to tell them about it, tell them how it would help you. And I think sometimes people are uncomfortable with rituals, but then they do them, and you're right, it typically does make them feel better. So I have done this by, even if somebody is refusing, to simply lead by example, and I'm going to continue to do it in hopes that if you see me doing it and it's benefiting me, that eventually the person will say, I would like to participate too, and continuing to invite them without judgment, without saying, I want to answer that by saying, I would, the way you frame it is very important, that I would love to invite you to do this with me tonight. I would avoid any harshness or any judgment if they don't want to do it, because they may just not be ready yet. So if I didn't answer that fully, put that right back in, and I'll elaborate as much as I can. Thank you. That's a great question. So, okay, so we can move on to the next slide from this. Supporting others, do's and don'ts. Do listen. There's so many times where there aren't words. It's okay not to have the right words. It's better to listen than to try to make meaning of something for somebody. So, for example, when I've been with a friend who's grieving, I'm really, at least at first, just going to be present, going to give them space to talk and to express. I don't want to put any judgment or assumptions on how they should feel or how they do feel. I want them to tell me. I definitely do not want to say, well, this could be because, for example, well, we don't know, there's some meaning. Sometimes people say spiritual things like, well, God is creating some meaning for through this. I would avoid saying anything like that. In a time of grief, it's better to listen, remove all judgment, and offer help. Just, can I do your laundry? One of the things that I'll share that helped me the most and my mother was my best friend, absolutely, in this entire world. the person that loved me unconditionally. And when I lost her, the practical, someone said, "What can I do?" And I said, "Can you please go get her belongings for me?" Because at that time, I couldn't do it. I just simply could not go and get the belongings. I know it seems like a simple thing, but it also seemed overwhelming. So, can I bring you a meal, or just I'm going to drop off a meal at 7. It'll be on your porch. Make it so the person doesn't have to do anything. Can I do your laundry? I'd like to do your laundry on Wednesday. Remember how overwhelmed someone is. So try to be as specific as you can, um, with offering very practical assistance. Even something as simple, I'm trying to think, people bringing, right, food, but also just things like toiletries, things that you wouldn't think of, that the person is not having time to get to the store, or they're so in shock and they're so upset. So anything practically that can just be, "Hey, I sent this to your house. I left this at your door. I'm thinking of you." Those are all great ways to offer support. Don't force conversations. People may not be ready to discuss their feelings. Someone like me, I talk about feelings all the time. I'm ready to talk about feelings, right? Some of you are probably like me and you're very comfortable with feelings. Other people are not so comfortable with feelings. They don't want to talk about things. They may turn inward. And those people, they're going to need more time. So, again, there's no right way for this. Don't force them. We can't be forcing people to, "You need to talk, you need to cry." Yes, I know that that will lead to acceptance and they need emotional expression. But the more we force them, actually, it has the opposite effect. People will pull away from us. If we're forcing someone to do something when they're not ready, it has the opposite effect that you want. So it's much better to do your best to try and be open and listen and offer support. And of course, being a stigma reducer and a therapist myself who has sought therapy for issues that I am speaking to tonight, when it's okay to say, "I think you should talk to someone. This is really hard. This is a really hard thing, and I think you should talk to someone." Okay, we can move on to the next slide. Um, I said this, oh, are we at the conclusion already, Lindsay? I was gonna say, I don't think we are. You see here. So to stress again, grief is very personal. So when I say that grief is personal and it's a universal experience, healing from grief is not linear. If we could graph this, for example, and people have attempted, this would be the messiest, ugliest graph. It would be peaks and valleys all around. Um, It is not only not linear, it's incredibly messy. Sometimes we think of grief as hitting us like waves. If you've ever been knocked down by a wave at a lake or an ocean, you know what that feels like. You could be standing out in the sun, it feels beautiful, you're relaxed. The next thing you know, you're slammed and you're hit. Grief can feel like that. We can think, "Okay, I'm sort of doing a little bit better." And then we have an emotional wave hit us and we're slammed with something else and new emotions. So typically over time, though, the wave goes from being a tsunami to more gentler waves, and we're still hit with feelings. But there's no right way. Also, I want to make note tonight that please think of seeking support as a sign of strength. Talking about your feelings and seeking support is not a sign of weakness. It is absolutely a sign of strength. And grief is heavy. the other thing that I know to be true about grief is it's the equivalent of, if I try to carry around, say, cinder blocks or huge pails of water all day, I can't do it. I can't do it alone. I need help. Grief has a heaviness with it. So, with that heaviness, know that you cannot lift it alone, nor should you lift it alone. This is why reaching out for help is so important. So wherever you're at on a personal journey, if you are still in a state of shock, if you are in a state of depression and it still feels paralyzing to get out of bed, know that the heaviness will eventually turn to hope in the midst of all of that darkness. It will, but it will take time and it will take support. It is not something that I want anybody to try to tackle alone, because I do know that that will set people up for worse emotional problems. And my goal is that everybody can be as emotionally healed as possible. So that is all I wanted to say about grief being an intensely personal journey, although a universal experience. I think we have, let's see, Lindsay, maybe we have more questions and answers, or we can move on if need be. Let's see. So I'm going to read a question. Um, Someone wrote in, my best friend recently lost her husband. I was there for an entire week, but since the service, I've not seen her. When I reach out to see if it's okay to come by, she always says not today, but she's doing things with other people. She does respond to text, and we've talked on the phone once. We live in the same town. I don't know how to feel. So that sounds to me, you were there for the entire week, but since the service, it seems like she is pulling back. Um, in that situation, to say uh advice in that situation is I would be as transparent as possible and say, friend, you're my friend. I care about you. I love you. I want to support you. Uh, I noticed that we haven't seen each other in some time. Is there something, is there a reason for that? Or, and just be transparent and ask and ask them. And also say, I would love to drop something off. We live in the same town. I would say, please don't take it personally. This is something that gets convoluted with grief. Um, we do get tempted to take things personally when we're offering support, and it can seem to be rejected. I would say just remember, when someone's in a state of grief, time also seems differently. Um, People may think that only a few days has gone by when even a few weeks have gone by. So I hope I answered that well. I would be transparent and say, I care about you and I want to support you. Um, how can I do that best? And um, don't give up. Don't give up. You sound like a really good friend. Okay, the second question says, I can tell, um, oh, the second one says, I can tell my family is struggling. No one is talking about it. How do I get them? We don't want to force anyone to talk, but this is where, if, and I'm not sure, maybe you want to write back in and let me know, can you talk about it? And if you're talking about it and saying, for example, I'm missing, I've been thinking about Jim, I've been missing him. Even that, statement, it can encourage other people to do the same. So if no one, it's sort of like if no one is doing something, I want to be the person to lead by example. And I know it hurts to see your family struggling. Also, with that, when you're leading through your own behavior, just remember people are going to be at a different time. They may not be at a different place in their grief. I don't know if they, my guess is they may be still in denial. I'm not sure how long ago someone passed, but people don't like to talk when they are in denial or stuck in denial. So sometimes it simply takes more space and time. Keep talking and keep being a good family member, and that should help. Um, and then um, it's someone wrote, I'm not sure if this is the same individual. I feel like I'm losing my family. Yes, you do need support too. I need support too. Absolutely get support. If they won't talk to you about it, then I'm going to say a friend, a friend, or if you don't have someone that will talk about it, that's where professional support and seeing a counselor. And I should say that seeing a counselor, if you've never done it, I promise it's not as scary as it seems. I've done it multiple times. To be therapists, we have to go through our own therapy, but many of us go to therapy for our own issues, just because I will speak for myself. I don't ever want to ask someone to do something that I wouldn't do myself or really believe in. Um, so yes, you need support, and seek out that support professionally if it's not in your personal life, because absolutely we all need support. Grief is so heavy. Do not try to do it alone. Let me see if there's anything else in the Q&A. Does anybody else have any questions that I can answer, or any um any other situations or questions? I'm happy to answer anything to the best of my ability. Oh, okay, here one is coming in. Are there free resources for grief for people that do not have insurance? I'm going to be perfectly transparent and say I don't know. I can find out and communicate through our marketing department. There usually are community mental health providers and clinics that will provide services on a sliding fee. I'm aware of that. Um, but yes, I understand it's especially when finances are tight, seeking support if you don't have insurance is not easy at all. Um, Okay, another question came in. I've tried individual therapy and don't feel like it's helping. Are support groups found to be as effective for grief as individual counseling? That's a good question. Thank you for answering it. To the best of my knowledge, the research is that both together, individual and group, are as effective. The reason in the research I'm thinking of is that the group support is very important because we know that we're not alone. Grief, and I should have said this, in individual therapy, and I'd say if you feel like it's not helping, I don't want anyone to do something that's not helping. Even with my own patients that I treat, if something isn't helping, my goal is always for someone to get the help they need. So if that's not for me, I would never, ever want someone to stay with me as in therapy if they were not getting the help they need. So I'll say that if it's not helping, don't do it. Support groups are great because grief is something that reminds me similar to, say, experiences that we really don't understand unless we live them. So I think of things like being a combat veteran, giving birth. There's certain things that we can imagine what they're like. Being a parent, losing a child. We can imagine what things are like, but the support groups are incredibly effective because they're people that have gone through the exact same thing as us. And that offers a tremendous amount of reassurance that honestly we can't get from somebody that may just not they may have the professional experience, and that's fine, but they may not have the life experience to resonate with you. So I am all for grief support groups. I think they're a tremendous amount of support. Um, okay, someone else wrote in about, do I offer support groups? Right now, I do not personally. Do I know of any places in Charlotte? I'm going to say this is something that gosh, that I wish I did and could say that I do. Um, there are, I don't know, Lindsay, if there's any way I can get back to this group or post information, but there are grief share groups. Um, I unfortunately am relatively new to this area myself, so I'm sorry. I don't know of any places locally in Charlotte. I'm sure there are. I mean, it's a pretty big city. I can't imagine that there would not be. I'm sorry that I can't directly answer that question. And I will definitely, because of this question, I will absolutely seek out the answer to that so that I know. I right now do individual therapy only and not groups. I have done groups in the past and do love group therapy as a facilitator and participant, but I'm not doing any groups currently, no. So again, I apologize that I don't know of where they are in Charlotte, but I I will find out since you've asked the question. I'm a person that if I don't know, I will certainly find out. Are there any more questions or thoughts about this topic of coping and of navigating this personal journey of grief and loss? Oh, it looks okay. How can I support my elderly mother? She's physically isolated but has no desire to FaceTime or meet friends. Thank you for that question. With working with the elderly is very difficult. I know that sometimes elderly people can be very receptive to technology. Sometimes there's challenges with things like FaceTime, or meeting friends. My initial thought is to support her by talking with her about, you know, I would want to say something along the lines of you're isolating, and that tells me that you're sad. Isolation is absolutely a sign of depression and sadness. So I would want to say, um, Mom, how can I help you to be less isolated? I want to help you. Letting people know that you want to help them, and maybe there's something she is willing to do. I would ask her, like, people will often say, I'm not willing to do FaceTime, or I'm not willing to meet friends. And then a good question is, what are you willing to do? You're telling me a lot of what you're not willing to do, which is good information, but what are you willing to do? Because at some point, we have to be willing to do something. So I would support through listening, validation, and gently challenging her to become less isolated by looking at what she is willing to do. I mean, are you willing to, uh, yes, exactly. You wrote back in, flip the script and ask questions. Yes, exactly. Because people, and if she's lost somebody, I'm not sure of all of the dynamics, but when someone has lost someone, the isolation and depression, if she may be stuck in a stage of grief. So, for example, if she's stuck in a stage of grief, asking questions can help people get unstuck. Okay. If you think she's stuck in a stage of grief, and if she's not willing to do a FaceTime or meet friends, I'm not sure if she'd be willing to seek professional help and say, you know, well, mom, there are counselors that specialize in grief. What will you do? Will you talk to someone? If you won't talk to me, if you won't talk to a friend, what will you do? Who will you talk to? Because, and I would point out to her again, we cannot going around carrying heavy bricks all day, all by ourselves. This is not something that we can manage without support. This is not meant for, grief is not meant to be in isolation. Human beings, we need connection, we need emotional connection. And when we're grieving, we need emotional connection even more. We need love, is what we need. And I can tell by the questions you're asking how much you love and care for your mother, and you don't want her stuck in a stage of grief. So flip that script, ask her what she's willing to do, and whatever she's willing to do, I would encourage it as much as possible and be very supportive in that. Great question. You're welcome. Okay. Let me see. I wish I could see you all. I'm such a relational person, and reading this is great. Thank you. But I'm so relational. I really wish I could see all of you and connect with all of you. Uh I'm 60 years old and have both parents living. One has a long-term disease, the other lives with me. I'm already worried about the likelihood of losing them soon and feel unprepared. That's and then goes on to say the shaking the feeling of anticipating death. That's such a good question. I should have brought up anticipatory grief. Um what this individual talking about is anticipatory grief when we know that someone, say for example, someone has Parkinson's disease or cancer, and we know maybe the doctor has said there's approximately 6 months left. That's called anticipatory grief. And um, the way, how do you shake anticipatory grief? Essentially, you're going through the stages of grief already. So, what I would say is, yeah, Parkinson's is a horrible disease that um, there's a few of them that I know people deal with a lot, MS, Parkinson's, that are just horrible. So acknowledge that you're already going through the stages of grief. So with the first one being denial, you don't seem to be there. You know what's going on. You know that the likelihood of losing them, I'm not sure what the doctors are saying of like how soon that's going to happen, but I really am an advocate for preparing for grief, and I can give you some examples for that. Um, Sometimes what people do is make recordings. Um, in a similar situation, I've had people say, like, Mom, Dad, can you please, like, say a message on this recording because I'm going to play it back later. And having as much connection, there's something really accepting and beautiful about knowing, right? We all know, here we are talking about grief and loss, and it- life is quite beautiful, and yet at the same time we all know that none of us get out of alive, right? We all know that eventually we'll get older and pass, or that something will happen. So I say that to bring you to acceptance, because how do I stop worrying about it? I accept that it is going to happen. And when we can reach that place of acceptance, we can say, well, Now what can I do about it? I want to get as many pictures as I can. I want to get as many recordings as I can on video. Yes, writing down letters. I had a family member that passed that was a World War II vet, and he wrote his entire story, and I cherish that. So saving all of those things helps us prepare. And it's not that it makes the pain any less. It certainly doesn't take away the grief. It doesn't take away the pain, but it does make you feel that you've made the best. Look, when for the time that you have left, when someone has a terminal disease and we know that there's only so much time left, it really is making the best of that time and getting all of those memories, asking them questions. Tell me things about your life that you want me to know. What do you want to be carried on to future generations? Give me those things so that I can take them and tell them to other family members. Um, that is very comforting. So I'm sorry you're going through that. It's anticipatory grief is very difficult. It's easier if you have in my experience, it's easier if someone says, okay, we know it's going to be 3 months. The more ambiguous it is, yes, absolutely, I can talk more about anticipatory grief. The more ambiguous the situation is, the more difficult the grief. So well, I just don't know. We don't know how much time is left is much harder. Um, so anticipatory grief, I'll talk more about that now since someone asked that. And thank you. Thank you so much for asking that. Anticipatory grief has a tremendous amount of anxiety. So whenever we're anticipating something bad, in my mind, I call it a trapdoor feeling. It leads us to hypervigilance. It leads us to sort of like I said, there's a trapdoor around a corner, or it's like being in a haunted house, like something's there and something's going to be there, but we don't know when that bad thing is going to be there. That's probably the best way I can explain that anticipatory feeling. So what happens is people can wake up every day. Yes, it's like something is lurking, something is there. And also that something that's lurking, we know, we know it's going to happen eventually. So the anxiety in the meantime can be dealt with through grounding techniques. I'm a big fan of grounding techniques. And what I mean by that is one is paying attention to our sensory experience. The anxiety is very real. The anxiety is very challenging. It's very real. Just responding to the comment, the fear, anticipatory grief, excuse me, equals intense fear and intense anxiety. Not knowing what the next day will bring, and if that day will be the day someone passes or not. It gets easier knowing, even though it's very tragic and sad. And you brought up, there's something else I need to talk about with anticipatory grief. When someone has a terminal illness, it is not abnormal and it is not uncommon to have a sense of relief that the person has passed. I know that there's probably people listening that are going to think that sounds horrible to say. It is human. We don't like to see our loved ones suffer. We do not like to live in fear every day of if they're suffering, how they're suffering, what is happening. So do not, with anticipatory grief, please do not be hard on yourself or beat yourself up if you feel a sense of this is over and it's a relief. Allow yourself the humanness to experience that. That is okay. As much as I have loved people, I don't want them to suffer. So that feeling of relief that comes after anticipatory grief, especially, expect it. Don't be afraid of it. It's normal. It's common. It is to be expected. And if you need support with it, reach out and get support with it. But please don't think there's anything wrong if you feel that way. Yeah. So someone wrote in saying, right, with not wanting to see someone suffer, but how hard it is to see the demise. It is, and I want to speak to that for a moment. Um, Seeing people be deteriorate, seeing people be on hospice, that can be traumatic for us. So there's another element of grief that can lead to trauma. So, um, I am really, really sorry that you're going through this. And yes, it's such a yes, so sorry that you're going through this. It's self-care. And again, I know that that is going to, I don't say that lightly because I know that it can feel selfish. I'm asking you to protect yourself from trauma. Oftentimes, there's nothing we can do anymore besides sit by someone's bedside and watch them deteriorate. That is awful and it's sad. And many times, I don't know how many of you know this, but many times when someone has a terminal illness, they will wait for family to leave when they're ready to pass, and they will pass when no one is with them. That's also very common. And then people feel guilty and they feel like, oh my goodness, I wasn't there when they took their last breath. When people are dying, please know that they start to detach because it's their way of saying goodbye to. They're also saying goodbye to you. And it's okay for you to take time and take care of yourself. It's not only okay, it's necessary so that you don't leave the grief experience. And I always think that family members, when we love people, they would not want us to be traumatized by what we see medically. Let me read this next comments. It can feel very intense and stressful. What are some things I can do in real time to help me? I get the self-care part, but sometimes I need it right in that moment. Yes. And what are some things you can do to help you right in that moment? This is going to sound really simple, but self-care looks really different. Sometimes self-care for me and for other people has been, I'm going to step outside and get fresh air. I'm going to go to the restroom and just have 10 minutes to get away from everybody when it's that intense. Because know that the question I ask myself when things are getting really intense is, what am I doing right now to be of service to anybody? So if it's my loved one that's laying in that bed and deteriorating, am I doing anything? Am I even able to do anything that's helpful? And if the answer is no, it's okay for me again, I don't want anyone to think like self-care. Sure, self-care can be a spa day. Self-care can also be going to get a Diet Coke from a vending machine and taking a short walk outside and just saying, this is too intense. I need to get away for a few moments because it is the stress. I'm glad you brought that up. The stress is enormous. Death is one of the absolute grief and loss, and dying is one of the most stressful things that we can go through. Also, I want to say that there is one theory, the theorist is Erik Erikson, but that's neither here nor there right now, that people die with either a sense of integrity or despair. So I'm not sure if the person feels they have a life well lived. That's definitely a better grief and loss situation. When we have an individual that has maybe anger or a sense of despair or regrets about their life, and I've seen that also, that makes for a much more difficult grieving situation. And I say that because you will need more support. If that's the case, you will absolutely need more support to deal with the stress. So in those moments, I'm going to say if there's nothing you can do that is making the situation any better, the my advice is to remove yourself just temporarily from that situation in an act of self-compassion. And I can't stress enough how we we tend to be so hard on ourselves at the heaviest of moments. We start doubting everything, questioning everything. So please bring some self-compassion to that moment and step away if you need to. I hope I answered it well enough. Um, so I think, I'm not sure if Lindsay, if you're still on here, I'm not sure what time it is. I think we're about wrapping up. Let me check doesn't look like there's any more questions. So I'm just going to say thank you so much. Oh, here's some resources that these are some of my favorite books as far as resources. So the one the I talked about the 5 stages of grief. That's one, but it's okay that you're not okay. The last one on the list is a great book, Meeting Grief and Loss in a Culture That Doesn't Understand. We don't really do a great job of talking about grief and loss. I want us to get better at that. I want us to do better at that. Um, so that's a great book, just acknowledging that it's okay to not be okay. The Year of Magical Thinking is very good. That one, like the firsts of everything are very difficult. First anniversary of the death, first birthdays, first holidays, very difficult. So those are all moments where you will need more support. So thank you so much. I feel so honored that all of you have spent this Thursday evening with me. I hope that it's been somewhat helpful. And if you are needing professional support, please uh, don't be afraid to reach out. There's the QR code is there for our advanced care behavioral health services. Um, I'm personally very proud to work for advanced care and be on a team that values healing and mental health care. So please reach out if you need help. I don't want anybody to suffer in silence ever. This is something that you need support with, and one of the most stressful things that you will ever go through in your entire life. It creates what we call a new normal, and there are people like myself and others that we're here, we're ready to help you find hope in the midst of all the hopelessness. So thank you so much for being here with me. Thank you for joining. And Lindsay, thank you for the support. And I wish everybody all a wonderful evening, and I wish you all healing. Thank you so much. Bye.